The year is 1182, and King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem can no longer feel his own fingers. Leprosy has ravaged his hands so completely that his attendants must lift him onto his war horse, wrapping what remains of his digits in silk to hide the decay from his men. He is 21 years old, and he is dying. Yet on this scorching morning in the hills above the Jordan Valley, this disintegrating monarch will lead 750 knights against an army that stretches to the horizon like a dark ocean, 30,000 of Islam's finest warriors commanded by the legendary Saladin himself. When Saladin's scouts report the size of the approaching Christian force, they laugh. A 42-1 disadvantage means military suicide, an execution rather than a battle. But by sunset, 2,000 Muslim warriors will lie dead in the dust, while the tiny Crusader force remains intact, having achieved what every military manual in existence says is impossible. 3 questions have haunted historians for 8 centuries. How did a force so vastly outnumbered not just survive but triumph? What revolutionary tactics made Crusader infantry suddenly invincible against the feared Turkish cavalry? And why did winning this miraculous victory actually accelerate the Kingdom of Jerusalem's destruction? To understand how the impossible happened, we need to travel back to the powder keg moment when a fragile peace shattered. The year 1180 had brought exhausted truce to the Holy Land, 2 years of uneasy peace between the Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin's growing Ayyubid Empire offered both sides precious time to regroup and recover. Baldwin ruled from Jerusalem despite his ravaging disease, and though only 19 years old, he had already proven himself a brilliant tactician at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177. But his body was failing faster than his kingdom could stabilize. Facing him stood Saladin, the merciful conqueror who had united Syria and Egypt under Islamic rule where previous Muslim leaders had squabbled endlessly among themselves. Saladin brought unity, discipline, and a singular purpose that terrified the Crusader states, the reconquest of Jerusalem. But here's what the chronicles deliberately obscure. The real catalyst for war wasn't religious fervor or competing claims to holy sites. It was pure greed embodied in one man. Reynold of Chatillon, the Mad Wolf of Kerak, controlled vital trade routes between Damascus and Egypt from his fortress perched on the cliffs at Kerak. Despite the truce, despite the oaths sworn, Reynold couldn't resist the glittering caravans that passed below his walls like rivers of gold. In late 1181, he attacked a massive caravan traveling from Damascus to Mecca. Among the travelers was Saladin's own sister, and the plunder was enormous, 200,000 dinars in goods, silk and spices and precious metals. When Saladin demanded compensation and the return of captives according to the laws of both Christian and Muslim conduct, Reynold laughed in the face of the messengers. "Let your Muhammad come and save them," he supposedly replied, an insult so profound it shattered the fragile peace like glass. Saladin called for jihad, summoning warriors from across his empire. By May of 1182, an army of 30,000 had gathered at Damascus. Regular cavalry, mounted archers who could loose arrows at full gallop, volunteer jihadi fighters seeking paradise through holy war, and professional Mamluks, those legendary slave soldiers who formed Islam's military elite. The numbers were staggering. If they marched in column, the army would stretch for over 15 miles. Their daily food consumption equaled a small city. The dust cloud from their march could be seen from 20 miles away. The Kingdom of Jerusalem faced absolute catastrophe. Baldwin could muster perhaps 1,200 knights from his entire realm, and most of those defended isolated castles scattered across a territory stretching from modern Lebanon to the Red Sea. The kingdom's strength lay in its fortresses, but that was also its fatal weakness. Defending everywhere meant being strong nowhere. Then Baldwin ordered the unthinkable: strip the castle garrisons. Leave minimum defenders in the fortresses. Concentrate every available man into one field army. His advisors thought he had lost his mind, that the disease had finally reached his brain. Raymond III of Tripoli, the kingdom's most experienced commander, urged caution. Better to lose villages than the kingdom, he warned, but Baldwin had chosen his ground with meticulous care. Belvoir Castle commanded the Jordan Valley from its hilltop perch 500 feet above the surrounding plains, controlling the main route from Damascus to Jerusalem. Its limestone walls were impregnable to anything short of a months-long siege. Saladin couldn't bypass it without exposing his supply lines to constant harassment. What followed was psychological warfare of the cruelest kind. Muslim raiders swept through the valley below Belvoir, systematically burning Christian villages. From the castle walls, Crusaders watched smoke pillars rise as their subjects' homes turned to ash. Each burning village meant lost tax revenue, fewer recruits, diminished supplies for the coming year. Saladin was teaching a brutal lesson in economic warfare, bleeding the kingdom through 1,000 small wounds. The Muslim chroniclers tried to hide this part, their accounts glossing over the systematic destruction, but Crusader records preserve the horror in detail. 60 villages reduced to charred earth in just 3 days. Women and children fleeing to Belvoir's walls with whatever they could carry. The kingdom hemorrhaging resources while Saladin's vast army consumed the countryside like locusts. But Saladin had made a critical miscalculation. By concentrating on economic destruction, he had given Baldwin precious time to execute his desperate plan. As Muslim cavalry torched villages, Crusader forces drilled together in something unprecedented, a revolutionary formation that would change medieval warfare forever. They called it the Iron Hedgehog, a name that appears in Latin chronicles as Aertius Ferus, and it represented a complete reimagining of how foot soldiers and mounted knights could work together. Modern military historians still can't fully explain how they developed and perfected it so quickly. Instead of knights charging ahead, with infantry struggling behind as traditional tactics demanded, the entire force would move as one organism. The 750 knights formed the center and rear, while 4,000 infantry created a bristling shell around them, a fortress that could move and breathe and strike. As dawn broke over Belvoir's limestone walls on that fateful morning, Baldwin's tiny army descended from the heights in perfect formation. What Saladin's scouts reported defied every principle of Crusader tactics they had studied for decades. The formation bristled with 14-foot pikes held by veterans who had drilled until their movements were synchronized like a single creature. Crossbowmen filled gaps between spearmen, and the knights waited like coiled springs ready to explode through designated openings in the wall of steel. 12,000 arrows darkened the morning sky as Turkish mounted archers unleashed their first volleys, the standard tactic that had shattered countless armies from Spain to Persia. But then physics and preparation took over. The Crusader formation raised shields in perfect unison, creating an overlapping shell. Arrows designed to pierce mail at 50 yards lost most of their power at the 200-yard range the mounted archers preferred for safety. If you're gripped by this story of impossible odds and revolutionary tactics, hit that subscribe button right now. These aren't just dry historical facts, they're lessons in human courage and innovation under the shadow of annihilation. Your subscription helps us bring more of these buried military miracles to light. Stories where tactical genius and desperate courage rewrote the rules of warfare. Don't let this channel's mission die like so many voices from history. Subscribe and be part of preserving these incredible true stories. The ground shook as 8,000 Muslim cavalry prepared for their first probing charge. Their commander, Emir Muzaffar al-Din, had broken Christian armies from Spain to Syria and watched for gaps, for panic, for that inevitable moment when discipline cracked under pressure. The first charge hit like thunder. 500 Mamluks in the vanguard, the absolute finest heavy cavalry all of Islam, smashed into the Crusader line at full gallop with lances leveled. What happened next defies belief. Instead of breaking, the infantry line bent backward like a bow, absorbing the impact. Pikes shattered, men screamed, horses reared in terror, but the line held. As the Muslim cavalry pulled back to regroup for another assault, crossbow bolts erupted from the Crusader formation. At 50 yards, a crossbow bolt could punch through mail armor like parchment. In 30 seconds, 80 Mamluk elite lay dead or dying, their magnificent armor no protection against the mechanical power of steel-armed crossbows. But Baldwin had collapsed mid-command. The disease consuming his body chose this moment to strike with full force. Witnesses reported him falling from his horse, caught by his bodyguard before hitting the ground. Yet even from a litter, barely conscious, the Leper King continued directing the battle with hand signals and whispered commands carried by runners. "Hold formation," he gasped through silk wrappings. "Let them come to us," the pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Muslim charges, the line bending but never breaking, devastating crossbow volleys as attackers withdrew. What happened next changed medieval warfare forever. Frustrated by the defensive formation's imperviousness, Turkish commanders ordered their specialty, the feigned retreat. 500 cavalry charged again, but fled after minimal contact, hoping to draw eager knights into pursuit where they could be surrounded and slaughtered. It had worked countless times before against less disciplined forces. But the Crusaders possessed one advantage nobody expected: absolute discipline born of desperation and the certain knowledge that breaking formation meant death for everyone. Not a single knight broke ranks. The infantry held their ground like bronze statues. The feigned retreat, terror of a dozen battlefields, had failed completely. Saladin watched from his command position on a nearby hill, counting Crusader casualties, measuring their cohesion with the eye of history's greatest Islamic general. Traditional tactics weren't working. The iron hedgehog was proving impervious to every standard approach in the Muslim tactical playbook. Then Baldwin ordered something unprecedented that would shatter everything Saladin thought he knew about Crusader capabilities. Instead of waiting passively for the next assault, the entire formation began advancing, not charging wildly as Crusaders were infamous for doing, but advancing step by synchronized step, the iron hedgehog rolling forward across the plain like an inexorable tide of steel. The psychological impact was devastating. Muslim cavalry trained for mobility and fluid combat faced an advancing fortress that seemed to swallow everything in its path. Saladin gave the order that would transform disciplined advance into chaotic hell. Full assault. All cavalry divisions, 8,000 horsemen thundered forward in the largest cavalry charge of the Third Crusade era. The ground shook with such violence that men inside Belvoir Castle later swore in written accounts that the walls trembled. The sensory overload was overwhelming. Dust clouds rising 100 feet high, the scream of thousands of horses, the crash of steel on wood as lances met pike shafts in explosive collisions. The Crusader line disappeared into a maelstrom of horses, dust, and violence. But the iron hedgehog didn't just bend, it flexed like a living organism. As Muslim cavalry crashed into one section, that portion of the line would buckle backward while adjacent sections swung inward like closing doors. The attacking cavalry found themselves not breaking through, but being funneled into kill zones where crossbow bolts flew from 3 directions into packed masses of horsemen unable to maneuver. At point-blank range, the devastation was absolute. A Templar knight wrote later, "The Saracens fell like wheat before the scythe, their magnificent cavalry dying pressed against our pikes, unable to advance or retreat. In 20 minutes, 400 Muslim cavalry lay dead or dying." The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. At this exchange rate, Saladin would lose his entire mounted force before breaking the formation. But Saladin wasn't retreating, he was learning, adapting, probing for weaknesses. The next assault combined every Turkish tactical innovation. 2,000 light cavalry attacked in waves, each group feigning retreat after minimal contact, trying to draw out impetuous knights. Mounted archers galloped past at 30 yards, each rider loosing 6 arrows in as many seconds before wheeling away. The discipline required to resist was superhuman. Young knights watching enemies flee gripped their reins until knuckles went white. But the formation held because they knew breaking meant death. Then came Saladin's calculation that marked him as history's greatest Islamic general. His army had lost 2,000 dead against 180 Crusaders. The exchange rate was catastrophic, and worse, his army's morale was visibly cracking. Warriors who had conquered from Egypt to Syria were being systematically destroyed by a force they outnumbered 42-1. "Signal the withdrawal," Saladin commanded, and his emirs protested violently. They still had overwhelming numbers. Surely they could break through. But Saladin saw what they didn't. The Iron Hedgehog could eventually be defeated, but at what cost? Lose 10,000 men to kill 750. Such a victory would be meaningless, leaving his army shattered to continue the campaign. The moment everything changed was when Baldwin ordered, "Hold position, no pursuit." The exhausted crusaders watched their tormentors retreat, too tired to cheer, too stunned to celebrate. Knights collapsed where they stood. Infantry leaned on blood-slicked pikes. The Iron Hedgehog finally dissolved into exhausted humanity. 2,000 Muslim dead carpeted the battlefield against 180 Crusader fallen, 400 wounded. By medieval standards, the casualty ratio was impossible, something that happened only in chronicles written decades later and growing in the telling. But this was documented reality. Baldwin had to be carried from the field, his body surrendering to disease and exhaustion. The kingdom's entire field army could barely muster 500 effective fighters. The evening revealed the true cost of victory. Yes, they had won a miraculous battle that defied all military logic. But Saladin's systematic destruction had worked perfectly. 60 villages lay in ashes. The kingdom's tax base for the next year was gone. No crops meant, no revenue meant no money to hire soldiers or maintain castles. They had won the battle but were losing the economic war. In the Crusader camp that night, exhaustion overwhelmed celebration. Men prayed in gratitude but also in fear, because 3 miles distant, Saladin's camp glowed with thousands of fires. He still commanded 28,000 men. The cruel truth that Baldwin understood in his final years was this: tactical genius could win battles, but economic warfare would win the war. Saladin had learned the lesson perfectly. 5 years later, in 1187, he would return not to fight pitched battles, but to systematically destroy the kingdom's economic foundation until the Crusaders had no choice but to surrender Jerusalem itself. The Iron Hedgehog had achieved the impossible, but impossibility has a price. Sometimes winning the battle means losing everything that matters. What do you think? Could any amount of tactical brilliance have saved the Crusader kingdom from economic strangulation? Was Baldwin's decision to strip the castle's genius, or at the beginning of the end? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. These aren't just ancient battles, they're lessons in how courage and innovation can achieve miracles, and how even miracles sometimes aren't enough against the grinding reality of resources and time.